The year was 2187, and humanity had finally touched the stars. It had taken centuries of war, failure, famine, and stubborn hope, but the people of Earth had built their first faster-than-light engine, and they had sent their first ships beyond the edge of the solar system, and for the first time in their long and bloody history, they were not alone. The signal came on a Tuesday morning, received by every satellite and radio dish on the planet at the same time. A deep, resonant pulse that repeated in mathematical patterns no natural phenomenon could produce. And within hours, the greatest minds on Earth confirmed what every ordinary person already felt in their gut. Someone out there was saying hello. The United Earth Council, a governing body born from decades of slow and painful cooperation between nations, selected Ambassador Lyra Voss to lead humanity's first contact delegation, and no one argued with the choice, because Lyra was the kind of person who could make happen. Enemies shake hands and make strangers feel like family, and she had spent 20 years negotiating peace deals in the worst war zones on the planet. So if anyone could speak for all of humanity, it was her. She boarded the shuttle with a small team of diplomats, scientists, and security officers, and they flew toward the massive alien fleet that had appeared just beyond the orbit of Mars. Hundreds of ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, gleaming with metals and alloys that Earth's scientists could not even name. The flagship was called the Throne of Silence, and it belonged to the Galactic Concordance, a coalition of over 4,000 alien civilizations that had governed the galaxy for more than 10,000 years under the authority of the Archon Council, 12 ancient species who had declared themselves the rightful rulers of all intelligent life. Lyra stepped aboard the Throne of Silence with her head held high and her heart beating fast, and she was led through corridors that hummed with energy and light, past alien species she had never imagined, tall insectoid creatures with shimmering wings, squat gray beings with 6 arms, slender figures made of what looked like living crystal, and every single one of them looked at her the way a person might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. The Archon Council received her in a chamber so vast it had its own weather, with clouds drifting beneath a ceiling that glowed like a false sun, and the 12 council members sat on thrones arranged in a circle, each one a representative of a species so old that they had watched stars be born and die. Lyra spoke with grace and courage, and she told them about Earth, about humanity's struggles and dreams and desire for peace, and she offered friendship, trade, cultural exchange, and a place in the galactic community. The council listened in silence, and when she finished, the eldest among them, towering being wrapped in robes of shifting shadow called the Prime Warden, spoke a single sentence that changed everything. "You are classified Tier 0. Lyra did not understand at first, but the translator in her ear kept working, and the words that followed made her blood run cold, because Tier 0 was the lowest classification in the Concordance, a label given to species deemed too primitive, too aggressive, and too dangerous to govern themselves. And under Concordance law, every Tier 0 world was assigned a patron species, an older civilization that would guide the younger one toward maturity. But guidance was a lie, and everyone in that chamber knew it, because in practice, a patron owned its Tier 0 world completely, its land, its resources, its labor, and its people. Earth's assigned patron was the Draythari Dominion, a species of cold-blooded reptilian oligarchs known across the galaxy for one thing: they worked their subject worlds to the bone, and left nothing behind but dust and graves. High Regent Voroth Sek of the Draythari stepped forward with a smile that showed rows of sharp teeth, and he looked at Lyra the way a butcher looks at livestock, and he said, "We accept responsibility for the humans," with great enthusiasm. Lyra tried to protest, tried to argue, tried to invoke any law or principle that might save her world. But the Archon Council had already moved on to other business, and 2 Drethari guards took her by the arms and led her away. Within weeks, the Drethari fleet descended on Earth like a plague. Orbital suppression platforms were deployed in a ring around the planet, massive stations bristling with weapons that could level entire cities in seconds, and dropships rained down on every continent, carrying soldiers in black armor who moved through human cities with the casual cruelty of an occupying force that had done this 100 times before. The worst part was the collars. They called them neural compliance implants, small devices surgically attached to the base of the skull that connected directly to the brain, and once activated, a collar could suppress independent thought, override free will, and reduce a human being to a obedient tool that followed orders without question or resistance. The Drethari began with Earth's leaders, presidents, generals, scientists, activists. Anyone who might organize resistance was captured and collared, and the process was broadcast on every screen on the planet as a warning. Lyra Voss was collared on live television. She had been giving a speech, a desperate plea to the people of Earth to stay strong and stay united, and the Drethari dragged her onto a platform in front of cameras that the whole world was watching. And a technician pressed the device to the back of her neck, and there was a sound like a click, followed by a hum, and the fire in Lyra's eyes went out, blown out a candle, and she stood there with a blank face and empty hands, while the whole world screamed. Nations fell in days after that, and some governments surrendered immediately, hoping cooperation would earn them mercy, and it did not, because the Drethari treated collaborators the same as resistors, as property to be used and discarded. But not everyone broke. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a military bunker that had been built to survive nuclear war and then forgotten by everyone except the people who maintained it, a man named General Kale Marin watched the broadcast of Lyra's collaring on a cracked screen, and his hands were shaking, but not with fear. He had served in 3 wars, buried friends on 4 continents, and carried scars that told stories he never spoke about, and he had thought he understood what cruelty looked like. But watching Lyra, brilliant, fearless, unbreakable Lyra, reduced to a hollow puppet in front of the entire world, taught him that he had not even begun to understand. Around him stood 37 men and women, soldiers and engineers and doctors, who had followed him into the dark when the sky fell, and they were bruised and tired and afraid. But they were also angry in the way that only humans can be angry, the kind of anger that does not burn out, the kind that turns into something harder than steel. Marin turned off the screen and looked at them, and the bunker was so quiet he could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the distant rumble of Drethari ships passing overhead. "They made a mistake," he said, and his voice was low and steady, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "What mistake?" asked Captain Rena Vasquez, his second in command. Marin looked at the dark screen where Lyra's empty eyes still haunted him, and then he looked at the people who had chosen to stand with him in this hole in the ground while the world above them burned. "Us alive," he said, "and they left us angry." No one spoke after that, because no one needed to, and in the silence of that buried room, something was born. Not a plan, not yet, but a promise, a quiet and furious vow that the chains the galaxy had placed on humanity would not hold forever, and that when they broke, the sound would be heard across every star in the sky. 3 years under the boot of the Drethari Dominion had changed the face of the earth. The great cities were quiet now, not because they were empty, but because the people in them had learned that noise drew attention, and attention from the Drethari never ended well. And so the streets of New York, and Tokyo, and Cairo, and Sao Paulo moved in whispers, heads down, eyes forward, hands busy with whatever labor the overseers demanded. The planet had been carved into labor zones, each one controlled by a Drethari regional commander, who answered only to the High Regent. And the zones produced everything the Dominion needed: rare minerals ripped from mountains, crops harvested from fields that humans were no longer allowed to eat from, technology assembled in factories where workers stood for 18 hours a day under the gaze of armed guards who did not consider them people. Millions had been shipped off-world already, packed into transport ships like cargo, and sent to Drethari mining colonies on dead moons and toxic planets, where the average life expectancy was 2 years, and the families left behind never received word of what happened to their loved ones, because the Drethari did not believe that livestock needed closure. But beneath the surface of this broken world, in tunnels and bunkers and forgotten places that the Drethari had never bothered to map, something was growing. They called it Ember. General Kale Marin had spent 3 years building a resistance network unlike anything the world had ever seen, and he had done it by being patient and invisible and ruthless in ways that surprised even himself, because the man who had entered that bunker under the Rockies was not the same man who now commanded a global insurgency from the shadows. Ember operated in cells, small independent groups scattered across every continent that never knew the full picture, never knew the names of other cells, never knew the location of Marin himself, so that if any single cell was captured and broken, the others would survive and continue. They communicated through a quantum-entangled mesh network that Dr. Senna Okafor had built from salvaged satellite components. The Drethari had dismissed as primitive junk. And the beauty of it was that the signal could not be intercepted because it did not travel through space in any way the Drethari understood. It simply existed in 2 places at once, and the aliens had never encountered a species stubborn enough to build a communication system out of technology they considered garbage. Dr. Senna Okafor was perhaps the most important person in the resistance, though she did not know it yet. She was a neuroscientist, one of the best on Earth, and when the Drethari came, they had not killed her or shipped her off-world. They had put her to work in a research facility in what used to be Geneva, forced to study human brain chemistry so the Dominion could improve the military. Efficiency of the neural compliance implants, the collars that had stolen the minds of Earth's leaders and silenced its strongest voices. Every day, she worked under armed guard, surrounded by alien scientists who treated her like a trained animal performing tricks. And every night she returned to a cell, barely large enough to lie down in. And every night she continued her real work, the work the Drethari did not know about. Because Senna had found something. The collars were not self-contained devices, and they did not operate independently. And this was the critical secret that changed everything. Every single collar on Earth received its control signal from a centralized relay system housed aboard the orbital suppression platforms. And if that relay was destroyed, every collar on the planet would go dead at the same time, and every collared human would wake up. She smuggled this information to Ember through a supply worker who was part of the network. It reached Marin in his underground command center. He read it 3 times, and then sat in silence for a long time, because he understood exactly what it meant. But Ember was not alone in its fight, even if it did not know it at first. His name was Thalin, and he was a Veli, a small, slender alien species with large, dark eyes and pale blue skin, who communicated as much through emotion as through words. And the Veli were one of the few species in the Concordance who understood what Earth was going through, because they had been Tier 0 once themselves, centuries ago, assigned to a patron who had drained their world dry before discarding them. Thalin had been stationed on Earth as a minor Concordance observer, one of dozens of aliens sent to monitor the integration and file reports that no one ever read. And he had watched the Drethari do to humans what had been done to his own people, and something inside him that he thought had died a long time ago came back to life. He made contact with Ember through channels so careful and hidden that it took 6 months just to establish trust. And when he finally met Marin face to face in a crumbling subway tunnel beneath London, the two of them stared at each other across a gap wider than species. And then Fallon spoke. "I can give you intelligence," he said. "Fleet positions, security rotations, the access codes for the orbital platforms. But you need to understand something first." "Tell me," Marin said. "Other species are watching what happens here," Fallon said, and his large eyes were filled with something that might have been hope or might have been grief. "Dozens of worlds are still under patron control, and they have been for centuries, and they have given up, and they believe that resistance is impossible. But if you fight and fail, they will forget you, and nothing will change, and the concordance will continue as it has for 10,000 years. He paused, and then said, the words that Marin would carry with him for the rest of his life. "But if you fight and win, everything changes." Marin nodded slowly, and he did not make promises, because he had learned that promises were easy and action was hard. But something passed between the two of them in that moment, a silent agreement that what they were about to do was bigger than Earth, bigger than any single world. Then the Harvest Revolt happened, and it changed the timeline for everything. It began in the Southeast Asian labor zone, in a rice processing facility where 300 human workers had been laboring under Drethari overseers for months. And on a hot morning, when the air was thick with humidity and exhaustion, a group of children, workers as young as 8, because the Drethari did not recognize childhood as a concept, failed to meet their production quotas. The overseer, a Drethari lieutenant named Kess, lined the children up in front of the adult workers, and executed them one by one with a plasma sidearm, and he did it slowly and calmly and without any sign of emotion, because to him they were defective units being removed from service. The adults broke. They rushed the guards with nothing but their hands and their rage, and the uprising spread through the facility and then through the surrounding zone, like fire through dry grass. And for 6 hours, the Drethari lost control of an entire region of Earth, and it took a full military response with orbital support to crush the revolt. Thousands of humans died, and the Drethari called it a minor disturbance in their official reports. But one of the workers had been wearing a hidden camera, an Ember operative, and the footage of the children's execution and the revolt and the massacre that followed was transmitted across the entire resistance network, and every cell on every continent watched it, and something that had been simmering for 3 years finally boiled over. Marin gathered his senior commanders in the deepest bunker Ember had, and he laid out the plan he had been building since the day Senna Okafor's message had reached him. A plan so bold and so dangerous that several of his officers thought he had lost his mind. He called it Operation Prometheus. "We cannot win a straight war," he told them. "The Drethari fleet outnumbers us 500 to 1, and we have no ships, no orbital weapons, and no allies, except one brave Veli with a death wish. And if we try to fight them on their terms, we will die, and Earth will die with us." He looked at each of them in turn, and his eyes were calm and hard and certain. "So we will not fight them on their terms, we will fight them on ours, and we will not try to defeat the Drethari, because we cannot, not yet. Instead, we will humiliate them in front of the entire galaxy, and we will make the Concordance see what it has allowed to happen, and we will make every species in every star system choose a side." One of his commanders, a young woman named Sergeant Dara Holt, raised her hand and asked the question everyone was thinking. "What happens if we fail?" Marin looked at her, and for just a second the mask of the general slipped, and she could see the man underneath, tired and grieving, and burning with a fury that had no end. "Then we make sure the galaxy remembers what it cost to put us down." No one else had any questions after that. The night of Operation Prometheus was the longest night in human history, and it began with silence. Across every continent, in tunnels and basements and hidden rooms beneath ruined buildings, Ember operatives checked their weapons and their equipment and their courage one final time. And then they waited for the signal that would either begin the liberation of their world or mark the moment of their extinction. Kale Marin stood in the command center buried deep beneath what had once been the Swiss Alps, surrounded by screens and maps and the quiet hum of machines that Senna Okafor had built from stolen parts and human ingenuity. And he looked at the clock and watched the seconds count down. And when the moment came, he spoke a single word into the quantum network that connected every Ember cell on Earth. Prometheus. Phase 1 was called Blind the Eye, and it was the most delicate and dangerous part of the entire operation, because everything depended on 11 minutes. For 3 years, Ember had been placing sleeper agents aboard the Dreythari orbital suppression platforms. Humans who had been selected for off-world labor, and who had endured the hellish conditions of the stations, while secretly waiting for this moment. And there were only 19 of them, across 6 platforms, and most of them knew they would not survive the night, and they did it anyway. At the moment Marin spoke the word, all 19 agents activated simultaneously, and they moved through the dark corridors of the orbital stations with the quiet precision of people who had memorized every patrol route, and every security gap, and every ventilation shaft, over months and years of patient observation. Their target was the collar relay, the centralized signal system that controlled every neural compliance implant on the planet. And Senna Okafor had given them a virus, a beautiful and vicious piece of code that she had designed to cascade through the relay like a wave, overloading every node and burning out every transmitter in sequence. Agent Tomoko Hayashi was the one who reached the primary relay hub on Platform 3, and she was bleeding from a wound in her side, where a Dreythari guard had caught her with a blade before she put him down, and her hands were shaking as she connected the device to the relay console, and she had 45 seconds before the next patrol found the body she had left in the corridor. She activated the virus and watched the screen fill with cascading errors, and the relay began to die. Not all at once, but in a spreading chain reaction that jumped from node to node across all 6 platforms. And the Dreythari technicians scrambled to understand what was happening. But by the time they realized it was an attack, it was too late. 11 minutes after Marin gave the order, the collar relay went dark. On Earth, 7 billion people felt nothing, but the ones who mattered felt. In a holding facility, in what used to be Berlin, Ambassador Lyra Voss had been standing motionless in a gray room, her eyes blank, and her mind locked behind the walls of the neural implant that had held her prisoner for more than 3 years. And then the hum in the back of her skull stopped, and the walls came down, and her mind flooded back into her body like water breaking through a dam. She gasped and fell to her knees, and the first thing she felt was pain. 3 years of suppressed pain and grief and fury hitting her all at once. And the second thing she felt was fury, and the third thing she felt was hope. All across the planet, collared leaders woke up screaming and crying and laughing, and for the first time in 3 years, they were themselves again. Phase 2 was called Steal the Sword, and it was the part of the plan that everyone said was impossible. Humanity had no fleet, and without a fleet, they could not fight the Dreythari in orbit. And without control of orbit, they could not hold anything they gained on the ground. So Marin had decided that if humanity could not build a fleet, they would take one. 3 Dreythari warships had been identified as vulnerable, vessels that were undercrewed because the Dominion had grown complacent after 3 years of uncontested occupation. Ships whose commanders had reduced security patrols because they believed humans were too broken and too primitive to ever pose a threat in space. Ember assault teams launched from hidden positions across the planet in stolen Dreythari shuttles, and they hit all 3 ships at the same time in coordinated zero-gravity boarding actions that were so fast and so violent that the Drethari crews barely had time to raise alarms before the corridors were filled with humans in improvised armor, carrying weapons they had built in secret workshops from scavenged alien technology. The fighting was brutal and close and ugly. Of combat, where you could see the fear in your enemy's eyes, and the Ember fighters took casualties that would have broken any other force. But they did not stop, because they were not fighting for territory or resources or power. They were fighting for their right to exist, and there is no force in any galaxy that can match the fury of people who have been told they are nothing and have decided to prove otherwise. Within 2 hours, all 3 warships were under human control. The largest of them, a Drethari dreadnought with enough firepower to level a continent, was rechristened on the spot by the assault team leader, Captain Rena Vasquez, who painted the new name on the bridge wall with a can of emergency sealant foam. She called it Defiance. Phase 3 was called Break the Mask, and it was the part of the plan that Marin believed would actually win the war, not with guns or ships, but with truth. The Galactic Concordance maintained an interstellar broadcast network that reached every civilized system in the galaxy, a communication infrastructure used for diplomacy and trade and cultural exchange, and it was considered untouchable and unhackable because it was protected by encryption designed by species that had been building computers when humans were still living in caves. But Dr. Sina Okafor was not just a neuroscientist. She was a woman who had spent 3 years inside a Drethari research facility with access to their systems, and she had studied their technology the way a prisoner studies the lock on their cell, and she had found the gaps and the flaws and the blind spots that no one else had ever looked for, because no one else had ever been desperate enough. Ember Signal Team, working from the captured Dreadnought Defiance, broke into the Concordance broadcast network, and for 17 minutes they transmitted unedited footage to every star system in the galaxy. Footage of the labor camps, the mass graves, the child executions, the collar implantations, the transport ships packed with human bodies, 3 years of suffering and cruelty documented by Ember operatives at the cost of their own lives. 4,000 alien civilizations watched. Some of them turned away, and some of them wept in whatever way their species wept, and some of them felt nothing because they had seen it before and had learned not to care. But none of them could pretend they did not know. The Drethari High Regent Voroth Sek watched the broadcast from his command ship and felt something he had never felt before: humiliation. And in his rage, he made the decision that Marin had been counting on. He ordered a full orbital bombardment of Earth's major cities. But the broadcast had already done its work, and when Voroth Sek demanded support from the Concordance observer fleets stationed in the system, 3 of them refused to participate, and 2 minor species withdrew their ships entirely, sent formal protests to the Archon Council, and suddenly the Drethari were not acting as the lawful patrons of a Tier 0 world. They were acting as butchers in front of witnesses. The Battle of the Break began in the space above Earth and lasted 14 hours. Kale Marin commanded the stolen fleet from the Bridge of Defiance, and he was outnumbered and outgunned in every way that mattered. And his crews were soldiers who had learned to fly alien ships in weeks instead of years. And by every logical calculation, they should have been destroyed in the first hour. But the Drethari had never fought humans in space before, and they were not prepared for what they encountered. Human pilots did not retreat when their ships were damaged. They accelerated, and they rammed their burning vessels into enemy formations with their weapons still firing. And Drethari commanders reported to Voroth Sek with something close to horror that the humans were treating their own deaths as weapons, that they were smiling as they died, that they were broadcasting music, loud, defiant, thundering human music, on open channels as they charged into the guns. The battle was not a victory in any military sense, and humanity lost more than it gained in ships and lives. But it was something more important than a victory. It was a statement, written in fire across the sky, that said, "We are here, and we will not be erased." The Archon Council, watching from across the galaxy as their carefully maintained order crumbled, made a calculated decision, not out of compassion, not out of justice, but out of pure political survival. Because the broadcast had set fires on 100 other worlds where subjugated species were rising up and demanding answers. They ordered the Drathari to stand down and declared a temporary cessation of hostilities. Vorath-Sek raged and cursed and threatened, but even he could not defy the council, and the guns went silent. And for the first time in 3 years, Earth's sky was not full of enemies. Lyra Voss, free and burning with a clarity that felt like being reborn, stood on the bridge of the Defiance beside Kael Marin, and she looked out at the stars, the same stars that had once seemed so full of promise and had turned out to be full of chains, and she opened a channel to the entire Concordance broadcast network. Her voice was raw and cracked from 3 years of silence, but it carried across the galaxy like thunder. "We are not your cattle," she said. "We are not your labor. We are not your property. We are not your Tier 0 classification. We are humanity, and we are done asking for permission to exist." The transmission ended, and across 4,000 worlds, the silence that followed was louder than any war. The galaxy had not expected humanity to survive, and it certainly had not expected what came next. In the 3 years following Operation Prometheus, the balance of power that had held the Concordance together for 10,000 years began to crack like ice under pressure, and at the center of every crack was Earth, small, scarred, furious, and refusing to be quiet. The Archon Council, desperate to restore order and prove that they still controlled the galaxy, convened a formal tribunal on their capital station to investigate the Drathari Dominion's conduct during the occupation of Earth, and they presented it to the galaxy as a shining example of justice in action, a demonstration that the system worked and that abuses would be addressed. It was theater, and everyone knew it. The plan was simple: bring the Drathari before the tribunal, issue a mild reprimand, impose minor sanctions, and then quietly reassign Earth to a new and gentler patron, while the galaxy moved on and forgot, because the Archon Council had been managing inconvenient truths for 10,000 years, and they were very good at making problems disappear. But they had not accounted for Lyra Voss. She arrived at the tribunal not as a witness, not as a victim, not as a representative of a Tier 0 species begging for mercy. She arrived as a prosecutor, and she brought with her 3 years of evidence, so meticulously gathered and so brutally documented that even the most cynical members of the council could not dismiss it. She brought the testimonies of survivors who had been worked nearly to death in off-world mining colonies, and she brought the medical records of children who had been experimented on in Drathari research facilities. And she brought the communications logs that showed the Archon Council had received reports of atrocities and had filed them away without action. And she brought the footage, hours and hours of footage, that showed in unflinching detail what the word patron really meant. The tribunal was broadcast across the galaxy, because the Council had intended it as propaganda, and they could not shut off the cameras without admitting that they had something to hide. And so 4,000 civilizations watched Lyra Voss dismantle the moral authority of the most powerful governing body in existence, with nothing but facts and a voice that never wavered. She did not raise her voice once, and she did not cry, and she did not beg, and that was what made it devastating. She simply laid out the truth with the calm precision of a surgeon cutting away dead tissue, and by the time she was finished, the council members would not meet her eyes. The Drathari representative tried to argue that the treatment of humans had been within the accepted norms for Tier 0 species, And Lyra looked at him and said, "Then the accepted norms are a crime." And the chamber was so silent after that, you could hear the blink hum of the station's life support systems. While Voss fought the war of words, Kale Marin fought the war of steel. He had taken the captured Drethari technology and handed it to every scientist and engineer humanity had. And he had told them one thing: make it better. And they had listened in a way that terrified the rest of the galaxy. What took other species centuries to develop, humans achieved in months. And the Concordance's intelligence services watched in growing alarm as Earth's shipyards, built from the wreckage of the occupation, began producing warships that were not copies of Drethari designs, but improvements. Vessels that were faster and tougher and more creative than anything the Dominion had ever built. The reason was something no alien species had ever fully understood about humans. They did not just learn technology. They played with it. They broke it apart and put it back together in ways that made no logical sense, until suddenly it worked better than before. And they did it with a speed that came from desperation and imagination combined into something that looked to outside observers like magic. Within 2 years of the cessation, Earth had a functional war fleet of over 200 ships. Advanced energy shielding adapted from Drethari designs, but improved beyond recognition. And weapon systems that combined human ballistic principles with alien energy technology in ways that made Concordance military analysts write very worried reports. The Drethari Dominion, meanwhile, was falling apart. The humiliation of the tribunal and the economic sanctions imposed by the Council, weak as they were, had exposed the cracks in the Dominion that had always been there, and the species that the Drethari had conquered and exploited for centuries began to stir, emboldened by the knowledge that it was possible to fight back and survive. High Regent Vorath Sek was deposed in a military coup by his own generals, who blamed him for the disaster on Earth, and believed that a change in leadership might save the Dominion from collapse. And his replacement, a younger and more pragmatic Drethari named Theron Vek, immediately reached out to Earth through back channels and begged for a private peace deal. Marin refused. "You do not get to surrender quietly," he told the Drethari envoy, and his voice was cold and final. "The galaxy will watch." But Marin was not content to simply free Earth, because the broadcasts during Prometheus had shown him something that he could not unsee. Earth was not the only world in chains, and there were dozens of Tier 0 species across the galaxy still living under the boot of their patrons. Species that had been enslaved for so long they had forgotten what freedom tasted like. He began the liberation campaigns. The first was the Veli homeworld, because Thalin had given everything to help humanity. And Marin believed that debts should be repaid. And when the human fleet arrived in the Veli system and demanded that their patron species withdraw, the patron looked at the fleet and remembered what had happened to the Drethari, and they left without firing a single shot. The Veli watched human soldiers walk through their streets, not as conquerors, but as liberators, and they wept openly in the way their species wept, with soft sounds like music. And Thalen stood among his people and felt something break open inside his chest that he had kept locked away for his entire life. After the Veli came the Korath, a sturdy and gentle species who had been forced to work in industrial hellscapes for 3 centuries. And after the Korath came the Solani, a species of artists and dreamers who had been reduced to manual labor because their patron considered beauty a waste of resources. And after the Solani came world after world after world. Every liberation was broadcast on the same network that had carried the footage of humanity's suffering, and every broadcast carried the same message: you are not alone, you are not forgotten, and you do not have to accept the chains they put on you. The most remarkable thing, the thing that made the galaxy truly afraid, was that humanity asked for nothing in return. No tribute, no loyalty oaths, No trade agreements, no military alliances. They simply freed the enslaved species and left. And when the liberated worlds asked why, the human commanders gave the same answer every time. Because someone should have done this a long time ago. The Archon Council watched their empire unravel and felt a fear they had not experienced in millennia. The 12 elder species had maintained their power through a simple principle: keep the younger species divided, dependent, and afraid. And humanity had shattered all three pillars in less than 5 years, and the coalition of liberated worlds growing around Earth was becoming a power block that rivaled the Council itself. But within humanity's own ranks, a rift was growing. Lyra Voss and Kale Marin had been partners in the liberation of Earth, two halves of the same mission, she the voice and he the sword. But as humanity's power grew, their visions for the future began to diverge in ways that neither of them could ignore. Marin looked at the galaxy and saw a system that was broken beyond repair, a system that would always produce new Drithari, and new Tier 0 classifications, and new chains, unless someone stood at the top and prevented it. And he believed that someone should be humanity, because they had earned it with their blood and their suffering. Voss looked at the same galaxy and saw something different. She saw the pattern repeating, the cycle of the oppressed becoming the oppressor, and she believed that if humanity seized the throne of the Concordance, they would become the very thing they had fought against. Perhaps not today, perhaps not in a generation, but eventually, inevitably, because power corrupts every species that holds it too tightly. They argued about it in private, quietly at first, and then with growing intensity. And their disagreement became the most important question humanity had ever faced. What do you do when you have the power to rule the galaxy? On a quiet evening aboard the Defiance, an Archon Council elder, one of the oldest living beings in the galaxy, a creature of light and memory called the Pale Witness, who had watched civilizations rise and fall for longer than most stars had burned, accessed a holographic map of the galaxy and traced the expanding sphere of humanity's influence, with something that other species would have recognized as dread. He turned to a colleague and spoke in a voice like wind through ancient stone. "We should have ended them when we had the opportunity," he said. "Now, I am not certain that we can." His colleague said nothing. There was nothing to say, because they both knew he was right. They came from every corner of the galaxy, and they came on their knees. 10 years had passed since the day the Concordance had arrived in the Sol system and declared humanity to be nothing, Tier 0, the lowest of the low, animals to be collared and worked and discarded. And now the greatest civilizations in the galaxy were sending their finest diplomats and their most precious gifts to a station orbiting the very planet they had tried to enslave. Prometheus Citadel hung in orbit above Earth like a crown of steel and light, a station built by human hands and human will, and the technology of a dozen liberated species who had pledged their friendship to the world that had broken their chains. And every day more ships arrived, carrying delegations from species that had once laughed at the idea of humans sitting at their table. The Archon Council sent representatives who spoke in careful and humble words that tasted like ash in their mouths, and they offered trade, agreements, and technology transfers, and formal apologies drafted by committees who had spent months choosing every word to minimize responsibility while maximizing the appearance of remorse. The insectoid Vren Collective, who had supplied the Drithari with the raw materials for the collars, sent a delegation carrying crates of the rarest crystals in the galaxy as a peace offering, and their ambassador could not stop trembling as she presented them. The Tholari, a species of massive silicon-based beings, who had voted to classify Earth as Tier 0 in the original council session, sent their eldest philosopher to make a public statement of regret, and he stood before the human delegation and spoke for 3 hours about the shame of his people in a voice that sounded like grinding stone. And the Drithari, what was left of them, sent their new leader Theron Vec in chains. He walked into the great hall of Prometheus Citadel with his wrists bound and his head bowed, a symbolic gesture of total submission, and behind him walked a procession of Drathari officials carrying the original documents that had authorized the enslavement of Earth, which they placed at the feet of humanity's leaders, and then stepped back and waited for judgment. Kale Marin looked at the chained Drathari leader and felt something dark and satisfying stir in his chest. A hunger that had been growing for a decade, and he wanted to accept the surrender and make an example that the galaxy would never forget. But Lyra Voss looked at the same scene and felt something entirely different. She saw the chains on Theron Vec's wrists, and she remembered the collar on her own neck, and she remembered the blank emptiness of 3 years spent as a puppet, and she understood with absolute clarity that chains were chains regardless of who wore them, and that the moment humanity started putting them on others was the moment humanity became the Drathari. Surrender. Marin stared at her across the conference table aboard Defiance, where they met in private after the ceremony, and for the first time in their long partnership, the tension between them was not something that could be set aside for later. "They are offering us everything," Marin said, and his voice was tight with controlled frustration. "The galaxy is offering us everything: control, authority, the power to make sure no species ever suffers what we suffered. And you want to turn it down?" "I want to make sure we do not become the thing we fought," Voss replied, and her voice was calm, but her eyes were burning. "Do you not see it, Kale? They are not offering us justice. They are offering us the throne, and every species that has ever sat on that throne has become a tyrant, every single one, for 10,000 years. "We are not them," Marin said. "Not yet," Voss said, "but you want to command a galactic military, and you want to enforce your vision of order on 4,000 civilizations. And you want to decide which species deserve freedom and which deserve punishment. And tell me, how is that different from what the Archon Council did to us?" Marin stood up and walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars, and he was silent for a long time. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "I am afraid," he said, and it was the first time he had admitted that to anyone. "I am afraid that if we do not hold the power, someone else will, and they will do what the Drathari did, and it will happen again." "It will happen again if we hold the power too," Voss said, and she walked to stand beside him. "Maybe not under us, maybe not under our children, but eventually, because that is what power does. It turns protectors into rulers and rulers into tyrants. And the only way to break the cycle is to refuse to start it." She put her hand on his arm, and for a moment, they were not the supreme ambassador and the general. They were just two tired humans who had been fighting for so long, they had almost forgotten what they were fighting for. "Let me try something different," she said. "Let me try something no species in this galaxy has ever tried." Marin looked at her, and he did not agree, but he trusted her more than he trusted himself, and after a long silence, he nodded. The next day, Lyra Voss stood before the assembled delegations of the galaxy in the great hall of Prometheus Citadel, and the chamber was so crowded that species who had never stood in the same room before were pressed shoulder to shoulder, and every screen in every system in the galaxy was tuned to the broadcast. She spoke simply, because she had learned long ago that the truth does not need decoration. She told them that the Tier 0 classification was abolished, effective immediately, and that no species in the galaxy would ever again be ranked or categorized or deemed less worthy of freedom than any other. She told them that the patron system was dissolved, and that every world currently under patron control was hereby declared sovereign, with full rights and full autonomy, and that any patron species that refused to release their subjects would face the combined response of Earth and every liberated world. She told them that the Archon Council was disbanded, because a governing body that had allowed slavery to persist for 10,000 years had no moral authority to govern anything. And then she told them what would take its place. She called it the Sol Accords, a new galactic charter built on principles that the galaxy had never tried before, not because they were complicated, but because no species had ever been brave enough to implement them. Every species would have one vote, regardless of age or power or military strength. The youngest civilization and the oldest would speak with equal authority. No species could own another. No world could be claimed by force. And sovereignty was not something that could be given or taken. It simply was. Disputes would be resolved through mediation, and defense would be shared through a cooperative fleet that belonged to no single species and served no single interest. It was, by the standards of galactic politics, insane. A system built on trust in a galaxy that had never known anything but hierarchy, and half the delegations in the room thought it would collapse within a year. But the liberated species, the Veli, the Korath, the Solani, and dozens of others who had been freed by human hands, rose to their feet and declared their support, and their voices filled the chamber like a tide. Marin watched from the back of the hall, and he felt the dark hunger inside him go quiet. Not gone, perhaps never truly gone, but quiet. Because he looked at Voss standing in front of the galaxy and saw something he had forgotten existed in there. Years of blood and fire. He saw hope. When the vote was called, he stepped forward and addressed the assembly, and the galaxy held its breath, because everyone knew that if the general refused the accords, he had the military power to impose a very different future. I have spent 10 years building a fleet to protect humanity, he said, and his voice filled the chamber, and I was prepared to use it to make sure no one ever threatened us again. And I still believe that the galaxy is dangerous, and that power is the only language some species understand. He paused, and then he did the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than Prometheus, harder than the Battle of the Break, harder than every fight he had survived. But Ambassador Voss is right, he said. If we take the throne, we become the Concordance, and everything we suffered, and everything we fought for, means nothing. And I will not allow that to happen. He announced that Earth's war fleet would be converted into the foundation of the Galactic Defense Cooperative, a shared force under shared command, answerable to the Sol Accords, and not to any single species. And he resigned his commission and stepped down from command. And as he walked away from the podium, the chamber erupted in a sound that no translator could process, because it was the sound of 100 species expressing shock and gratitude and awe in 100 different ways all at once. Lyra Voss closed the assembly with words that were transmitted to every corner of the galaxy, words that would be carved into the walls of Prometheus Citadel and taught to the children of 10,000 worlds. You tried to collar us, she said. You tried to break us and classify us as less than nothing. And when we rose, you expected us to do what every empire before us has done, to take our turn holding the whip. She looked across the sea of alien faces, and her voice did not waver. But we are not you. Mercy is not weakness. It is the one thing no species in this galaxy has ever had the courage to practice. Until now. The hall was silent, and then it was not. Years later, on a warm afternoon on Earth, Thallon the Veli walked through a garden that had been built on the ground where a Drethari labor camp had once stood. And the soil that had been soaked with human suffering now grew flowers of every color, and the air was filled with the sound of children laughing. Human children, and Veli children, and Korath children, and Solani children, all playing together in the sunlight, as if the borders between species were just lines drawn in sand that the wind had blown away. Thallon sat on a bench beneath a tree that had been planted the day the Sol Accords were signed. And he watched the children play, and he thought about the day he had met Kale Marin in a crumbling tunnel beneath London, and had told him that if humanity won, everything would change. Right. But he had not imagined how much. He thought about the Concordance's classification system, the neat and orderly ranking that had placed every species in a box and told them how much they were worth. And he thought about the label that had been placed on humanity. Tier 0, a lowest of the low, the species that was not worth knowing. And sitting there in the garden, watching the children of a dozen worlds play together beneath a sky that was finally free, Phelan smiled and thought to himself, they were never Tier 0, and they were something the galaxy had never had a classification for. Because there is no category for the species that teaches the universe what mercy means.